Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, deep beneath the mountains of Pennsylvania, in the year 1891, a group of coal miners entered the darkness of the underground world searching for one thing: coal. But what they encountered far below the surface became a story that would spark questions for generations. At a time when America was rapidly changing through industry and innovation, miners were pushing deeper into the earth than ever before. Every tunnel revealed new challenges, hidden dangers, and unexpected discoveries waiting beneath layers of rock. What was found in those depths? Was it a forgotten piece of history, a strange geological wonder, or something that challenged what people thought they knew about the underground world? For more than a century, this mysterious chapter from Pennsylvania's mining history has continued to capture the imagination of researchers and history lovers alike. Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we descend into the forgotten tunnels of 1891 to uncover the story of the Pennsylvania coal mine discovery that shocked the world. So dim the lights, relax, and join us as we journey deep beneath the earth to explore a mystery hidden in the shadows of America's industrial past. The year was 1891, and in the quiet, hardscrabble hills of Pennsylvania, a coal miner descended further into the earth than any man in the state had ever dared to venture before. He wasn't seeking lost treasures or unearthing ancient history. His quest was far more practical and desperate than that. He was chasing coal, the very same glossy, black seams that stoked the furnaces, drove the steam locomotives, and built the vast fortunes of a rapidly industrializing nation. Yet, far below the final surveyed depth, where his lamp should have illuminated nothing but an endless expanse of rock and dust, his pickaxe struck through into something that simply wasn't meant to be there. It wasn't a new vein of precious ore, nor a pocket of trapped gas, but something crafted, something ancient. When the news of this discovery finally traveled up the creaking shafts and into the light of day, it had a peculiar effect. It silenced the hardened men of that town in a way that the constant threat of cave-ins and coal dust never had. Stay with me tonight, for this is one of those rare stories that official history chose to overlook. It's the kind of tale that surfaces every few decades in the brittle pages of old newspapers and forgotten geological surveys, only to be swallowed back into obscurity before any authority has to offer an explanation. We are going to journey through what happened beneath that small Pennsylvania town in 1891, slowly, deliberately, with the same careful pace the miners themselves adopted as they crept through that narrow passage, their lives depending on nothing more than an oil lamp and sheer nerve. If you're listening to this to drift into sleep, then you are precisely the person I make these videos for. Perhaps you could subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are in the world right now, and what time it is as you listen. The town that was the stage for these events doesn't appear on most modern maps under the same name it had back in 1891. Towns like it, forged by a single industry, rarely survived the century that built them. It came into being because of the coal, and it would inevitably fade away because of that same coal. But in 1891, it was a vibrant, bustling hub of activity. It was a collection of simple wooden houses and company-owned shops, all strung along a single, muddy road that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. A heavy blanket of smoke usually hung over the rooftops most mornings, not just from the chimneys of the homes, but from the enormous breaker towers on the edge of town. These machines, which crushed and sorted the coal, never seemed to rest. They ran day and night on a relentless rhythm that the townspeople had long since stopped hearing as noise. It was simply the constant drone of their world. Children grew up with it in the same way that children in the countryside grew up with the sound of crickets or church bells. Men who had spent 30 years laboring in those dark seams claimed they could tell the exact time of day simply by listening to the subtle shifts in the grinding pitch of the breaker as the afternoon wore on and the metal gears expanded with the heat. This was anthracite country, the hard coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania, where the seams of coal twisted and plunged deep into the earth, far more unforgiving than the soft, bituminous coal found further west and south. Anthracite burned hotter and cleaner, making it immensely valuable, which in turn made the men who risked their lives to mine it valuable in the cold, economic sense that mattered to the far-off companies that owned the land and everything beneath it. By 1891, these companies had been pushing their shafts deeper and deeper for almost 2 decades, chasing seams that dipped and turned in ways no one could have predicted from the surface. They followed the coal like a man follows a stream uphill, never fully sure where it might lead, but driven by the necessity to keep going. And the deeper they went, the more it cost to dig. With each increased expense, the pressure from the company's boardrooms in Philadelphia and New York intensified, demanding that every foot of new shaft be justified by the tonnage of coal extracted. The miner at the heart of our story was an unremarkable man before that fateful year. In most official records, he barely became remarkable after it either, which is itself a strange and telling detail. By all accounts that survive, he was an ordinary man in the same way that most of the men who built America's industrial backbone were ordinary, meaning he possessed an extraordinary resilience and skill that no one ever thought to write down. He had entered the world of mining just like most boys in that region, starting as a breaker boy, sorting slate from coal with hands that bled in the winter from the cold and the sharp edges of the broken stone. He gradually moved into the deeper, more perilous work underground once he was old and strong enough to be trusted with a pickaxe and a lamp. By the time he had reached his 30s, he had developed a particular instinct that all the best miners possessed, and that no amount of company training could ever replicate. He had an almost physical sense for when the rock was about to give way, a deep awareness of the different sounds between solid stone and stone that was about to crumble, and an acute sensitivity to the faint changes in air pressure that signaled the presence of hidden gas. He was known among his peers for being cautious in a profession that didn't reward carefulness with speed. And speed was all the foreman cared about, because speed meant tonnage, and tonnage meant the company stayed profitable and the town stayed employed. There is a specific tension that runs through every account of deep coal mining from this period. It is a strain between the men who understood that the earth was indifferent to their quotas, and the companies who desperately needed those quotas met anyway. This underlying friction simmers beneath everything that happened in the weeks leading up to that discovery, waiting like a seam of its own. The particular shaft he was working that year had been sunk only a few years earlier, and it had been chasing a coal seam that stubbornly refused to follow the predictions of the geological surveys. It kept dipping lower, running deeper than anyone in the company's offices had budgeted for, which created exactly the kind of friction that pushes men past their breaking points. The company wanted the coal. The coal kept retreating deeper, and so the shaft kept following it, spiraling down past depths that had once been considered the practical limit for this part of the coal field. They were venturing into territory the surveyors admitted they had no accurate maps for, because no one had ever needed to map such depths before. They were at the very edge of the known world, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, physical one. Several hundred feet of freshly excavated rock that existed only in the hastily scribbled notes the foreman kept by lamplight in the pages of a worn notebook. It is worth pausing to reflect on that small detail for a moment, because it is crucial to everything that follows. This was not an established mine with decades of careful planning behind it. This was new ground, freshly torn open, the kind of place where geological surprises were not just possible, but almost to be expected. No one had ever stood at that depth before, looking at that particular face of rock. The miners who worked it understood this on a fundamental level. They spoke about it in the hushed, darkly humorous tones that men use when they are forced to operate within a profound uncertainty they have no power to change. They developed small private rituals, superstitions that had nothing to do with official religion, and everything to do with the deep-seated human need to feel some semblance of control over a situation where control was largely an illusion. Even before the discovery, stories were already circulating. These are the kind of tales that tend to sprout in places where men spend 10 or 12 hours a day in absolute darkness, with nothing but the thin yellow glow of an oil lamp attached to their caps. The miners in that shaft had reported strange drafts of air coming from sections of rock that should have been solid. They spoke of cold gusts that carried a strange, unfamiliar mineral scent. Not the usual smell of sulfur or damp stone, but something else. More than one man described it independently as smelling like very old water. Water that had been trapped somewhere untouched for an unimaginably long time. Sound, too, traveled strangely down there. Men described echoes that seemed to arrive from the wrong direction. Phantom taps and shifts in the stone that didn't correspond to the rhythm of any pickaxe. Most of this was almost certainly just the odd acoustics of deep rock, where sound waves bend and travel along fractures in ways that can confuse even the most experienced ear. But that phrase almost certainly is doing a lot of work, and the miners themselves were not so confident in that explanation. The foreman in charge of that section, a man whose name appears briefly in company records but who left behind almost nothing personal beyond a few terse entries in a shift log, had grown increasingly frustrated with the slow progress. The unpredictable rock was proving difficult to dig through, so he made a decision that, in hindsight, was fateful. He authorized the use of extra blasting powder. He wanted to speed up the breakthrough into what the surveyors believed was the next pocket of the coal seam. This is the critical detail that historians have latched onto, because it means that what happened next was not the result of careful, incremental excavation, but of a deliberate choice to blast through faster than caution would normally allow, driven by the pursuit of a coal seam that, as it turned out, wasn't even where they thought it was. The blast went off on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon shift, a detail preserved in the surviving records. The timing was such that the aftermath would be discovered not by the full crew, but by a smaller group finishing the day's work, while most of the other men had already been moved back to safer ground. Among that small group was the miner our story follows. According to the only detailed first-hand account that has survived, written down years later and preserved almost by chance in a private collection rather than any official archive. He was the first man to approach the blast site once the dust had settled enough to breathe. What he expected to see was broken rock, perhaps coal if they had been lucky, or just more useless stone if they hadn't. But what he found, according to his account, was something else entirely, a hole in the world that should not have been there. It wasn't a natural cavity, not the kind of void that sometimes opens up in coal country when groundwater has been dissolving the softer rock for centuries. This was different. The edges of the hole were sharp and clean, regular in a way that natural stone almost never is. It framed an opening into a space beyond, a space that didn't reflect his lamplight like the usual dull sheen of raw coal and shale. The light simply seemed to be swallowed up by it. He stood at that opening for what he later described as a long while. But in his account, he admits he couldn't say for certain how long it actually was. Time plays tricks on you in moments like that, stretched and distorted by adrenaline in ways that defy any normal clock. He called out, but nothing answered except an echo that sounded wrong, layered and complex, as if it were bouncing off surfaces that were much further away and much more numerous than any simple tunnel could produce. He held his lamp forward, pushing it into the opening, and there, just at the edge of the light, he saw the outline of something that was not rough stone. It had edges, a deliberate regularity to it. Every instinct that his many years underground had honed screamed at him that it should not exist at that depth, in that type of rock, in a place where no human being, as far as anyone knew, had ever stood before. That is where we will leave him for now. standing at the edge of a hole that defied explanation, his lamp throwing a fragile circle of light into a darkness that had apparently been waiting, undisturbed, for longer than anyone in that mine, or that town, or that entire part of the country could have possibly imagined. In the next part of this journey, we are going to step back and understand exactly where this mine was situated. We need to explore why this particular stretch of Pennsylvania already carried a quiet, half-forgotten reputation for things that didn't fit the official, sanitized version of American history. We need to look at why the company that owned this shaft would spend the better part of the next decade trying desperately to ensure that this moment never became more than a whisper. To understand the full weight of this discovery, and why it frightened the people who needed to keep digging coal more than they wanted to know what they had found, you have to understand the ground itself. Not just the geology, but the long, strange history of what people already believed might be buried beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, long before a single shaft had ever been sunk. This was not untouched ground when it came to stories of things that didn't belong in conventional history. Long before the anthracite companies began chasing seams 2,000 feet down, the world above had already produced its own quiet tradition of unexplained finds. These were the kind of finds that would get a single paragraph in a county history book and then vanish from public memory, because no one in a position of power wanted to follow the thread. Pennsylvania, and the broader Ohio and Mississippi Valley region to its west, had been producing reports of enormous earthworks and burial mounds since the very first days of European settlement. These structures were so vast and so geometrically precise that the first surveyors who laid eyes on them almost reflexively assumed that no indigenous population could possibly have built them. This assumption says far more about the surveyors than about the structures themselves. But for a long time, it became something close to established fact among educated Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. The mounds, they reasoned, must have been built by some earlier, more advanced race. A race that had vanished or been destroyed long before the tribes the settlers encountered had arrived. This idea, often called the myth of the mound builders, wasn't considered fringe thinking. It was discussed in serious scientific journals and debated in the halls of early American learned societies. It was also used, often quite deliberately, as a justification for displacing the very communities who might otherwise have been recognized as the actual builders. By the time our miner was working his shaft in 1891, the scientific consensus on the mound builder question was just beginning to shift, slowly and uncomfortably, towards the conclusion that indigenous peoples themselves had built these incredible structures. A conclusion that should have been obvious from the start, but that had been resisted for decades because it made a lot of people deeply uncomfortable with the story they were telling about the land they had taken. The Smithsonian Institution, through its Bureau of Ethnology, had been conducting a sweeping survey of these mounds throughout the 1880s. They sent teams across the eastern half of the continent to measure, excavate, and catalog thousands of sites in what was one of the largest archaeological undertakings the federal government had ever funded. That survey would eventually produce a report, published just a few years after the events of our story, that finally and formally dismantled the lost race theory and credited the indigenous nations with the construction of the mounds. But surveys like that are slow, and the consensus of scientists in Washington doesn't travel quickly to the coal towns of the Pennsylvania hills. Men who spent their days underground had their own deep, folk knowledge of what might be down there, passed down through generations of digging and the occasional, unsettling discovery. Miners in this region had broken into strange pockets and chambers before 1891. They had found fragments of worked stone, pieces of pottery, and, in at least two well-documented cases that predate our central story, human remains that had been deliberately positioned. They were placed as if for burial rather than by accident, at depths that made no sense for any burial practice anyone could readily explain. These finds were reported briefly in regional newspapers, treated with a kind of amusement, and then largely forgotten, filed away in that part of public memory reserved for things that are curious but inconvenient. What made the region around our miners' town distinct, even among other parts of anthracite country, was a specific and persistent local legend that predated the mine itself. The older residents of the town, particularly those of Welsh and Pennsylvania Dutch descent who had been farming that land before the coal companies arrived, would tell a story about a particular ridge a few miles from where the shaft was eventually sunk. According to a version of the story collected decades later by a folklorist working for a regional historical society, the ridge was avoided by the area's earliest farmers. It wasn't out of fear, exactly, but out of a deep, inherited caution, the kind of caution people maintain about a place even after they have forgotten the specific reason for it. The story held that the ridge was hollow. Not hollow in the ordinary sense of containing a cave, but hollow like a drum, meaning that certain sounds made on its surface produced echoes that were far too deep and resonant to come from solid earth. There was also, woven into that same body of folklore, a fragment about lights. Not lights in the sky, which is the kind of folklore that tends to survive because it fits neatly into modern traditions of UFOs, but lights from the ground itself. They were said to be faint and intermittent, glimpsed by a handful of residents over the better part of a century. The lights were always reported near that same ridge, always at night, and they were always described in the same frustratingly vague terms: a dim, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from beneath the surface rather than upon it. Nobody who told this story claimed to have investigated it. The land around the ridge was rocky and difficult to farm, so it was largely left alone. This meant that whatever was producing those lights, if anything was producing them at all, and it wasn't just a trick of marsh gas or reflected moonlight, was never disturbed long enough for anyone to get a good look. The mine that would eventually make the discovery at the heart of our story was not sunk directly into that ridge. It was sunk into the valley adjacent to it. Following the geological logic of the coal seems rather than any local superstition. For the first few years of its operation, no one connected the two. Coal mining and ridge folklore occupied entirely separate categories in the minds of the townspeople. One was a serious economic reality that put food on the table. The other was the kind of story told to children to keep them away from dangerous, unstable ground. It was only after the events of 1891, when men who had grown up hearing the ridge stories found themselves staring into a chamber that shouldn't exist at a depth that made no geological sense, that the older residents began to quietly murmur that the mine had simply tunneled by accident into the edge of whatever the ridge had always been hiding. This connection, speculative as it is and will likely remain, matters for one specific reason that becomes important later. If the chamber the miner found was connected to whatever lay beneath that ridge, then it was not an isolated pocket of freak geology. It wasn't a single, abandoned structure. It was a part of something larger, a system, a network of spaces that threaded through the rock beneath that landscape for an unknown distance. It was a space that the coal companies had been blasting through for years without any sense of what they might eventually be cutting into. And if that was true, then the discovery our miner made was not the whole story. It was simply the first piece of it to surface, the first thread that someone happened to pull on a tapestry that had been quietly, patiently waiting under the hills of Pennsylvania for longer than anyone in that town, or that century, was prepared to understand. Back at the blast site, the miner didn't go in alone. Not at first. And this detail is important, because it means what happened next wasn't the figment of one man's imagination or a tale that grew in the telling over a bottle of whiskey. According to the surviving records, there were 3 other men present in that section of the shaft when the breakthrough happened. Their names appear scattered across payroll ledgers and the occasional company memo, but they, like the central figure of our story, left behind almost nothing in their own words. One of them, the oldest of the group, had nearly 30 years underground behind him. He had, by his own account, relayed secondhand by a relative later on, seen exactly 2 things in his career that he couldn't explain through ordinary geology. This discovery, he later said, would become the third. The four men stood at the opening for a period of time that none of them later agreed on. This is a small but telling detail. Miners of this era were generally careful about time, trained by necessity to track shift hours and blast timings with real precision. Their disagreement about how long they stood there, ranging in later retellings from a few minutes to what one man insisted was closer to half an hour, speaks to the deeply disorienting nature of the moment. It was the kind of temporal confusion that tends to accompany genuine shock, not simple observation. What finally convinced them to move forward wasn't curiosity alone, but a far more practical, life or death concern. The heir, the oldest miner, the one with 30 years of experience, held his lamp close to the opening and watched the flame. This was the oldest and most reliable instrument any miner had for detecting gas. A low, guttering flame signals a depletion of oxygen. A flame that burns unusually tall and blue can signal the presence of methane. And a flame that simply goes out is the signal every miner is trained from his first week to obey without question, because it usually means death is close behind it. The flame, by his account, did none of these things. It burned steady, and if anything, it was slightly brighter than it had been in the tunnel behind them. This meant, counterintuitively, that whatever lay beyond that opening was not a sealed, oxygen-starved pocket. It was connected somehow to a larger source of air. This raised an immediate and deeply unsettling question. Connected to what? And reaching how far? And who or what was ventilating it? This was the detail that convinced the oldest miner to step through first, his lamp extended, the other three following close behind in the loose single-file line that men adopt instinctively when moving through unfamiliar darkness. The passage beyond the blast opening was narrow at first, so narrow that a man's shoulders would brush both sides. And the walls here, unlike the rough, blasted stone immediately behind them, were smooth. Not polished like a finished stone floor, but worn smooth, the kind of smoothness that comes from long exposure to moving water or from deliberate, careful shaping by tools. In the dim lamplight, it was impossible for the four men to say with any certainty which explanation applied. They only knew that the wall didn't feel like the raw coal rock they had spent their lives learning to read with their hands as much as their eyes. The passage ran for perhaps 60 feet before it opened, suddenly and without warning, into a space so vast that their lamps couldn't begin to illuminate it. This is the point in every later retelling of the story where the account becomes both most vivid and most frustratingly vague. The men were describing the experience of seeing something at the absolute edge of available light, in a moment of profound fear, in conditions where every sense was primed by years of training to interpret darkness as a potential threat. What they agreed on across every version of the story that survives was that the space was large, larger than any natural cavity any of them had encountered in their combined decades of work. So large that the small circle of light from their 4 oil lamps, held together in the center, didn't reach any of the surrounding walls. They could only see a vague suggestion of where those walls might be, somewhere far beyond the reach of the flame. The floor beneath their feet in this larger chamber was different again from the smooth-walled passage. It was uneven, scattered with what felt like loose rubble underfoot. At least 2 of the men later reported stepping on or near objects that were clearly not natural stone fragments. Objects with edges too regular, too deliberate to be the product of any random rockfall or collapse. One of these objects, picked up and examined by lamplight, was later described in the single surviving written account that goes into the most detail as a flat piece of stone, about the size of a man's palm. It was worked on one side into a series of shallow, parallel grooves, evenly spaced. None of the four men recognized the pattern as belonging to any tool or technique they had ever encountered in their work, mining or otherwise. It is worth pausing here to be honest about the limits of what we can verify almost 130 years later. The objects these men described handling that day did not, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever make their way into a museum, a university archive, or any institution with the resources to properly study them. What we have instead is testimony that is often second-hand and third-hand, filtered through the memories of men who were frightened, working in dangerous conditions, and entirely unequipped to document an archaeological find. This doesn't mean their testimony is worthless. It means we have to treat it the way careful historians treat any uncorroborated account from people who had every reason to tell the truth and no apparent reason to lie. That is, with serious interest and appropriate caution in equal measure. What happened next, according to the account that survives, was that the oldest miner, the one with 30 years of experience, made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He called the group back, not because anything in the chamber had directly threatened them. There was no collapse, no gas, no sound or movement beyond the strange, layered echo their own voices made in that open space. He called them back because he recognized, with that particular instinct, that this was not something four men with picks and oil lamps should be exploring on their own in the dwindling hours of an afternoon shift. They had no surveying equipment, no proper lighting, and no one on the surface who knew exactly where they were. They retreated back through the narrow passage, back through the blast site, and back up towards the surface, carrying with them the worked stone fragment, and by at least one account, a second object that one of the younger men had pocketed without fully examining it in the dim light below. They did not, according to every surviving record, tell the other men on their shift what they had found. Not immediately, not in any detail. What they did instead was go directly to the foreman, the same man who had authorized the extra blasting charges that had opened the passage in the first place. And it is in that conversation, held in the small company office on the surface as the light outside was beginning to fail, that the story stopped belonging entirely to the miners. It began to belong, in a way that would prove consequential for years afterward, to the company that employed them. The foreman's reaction, as it was later described by at least two of the men present, was not what any of them had expected. He didn't dismiss them, which would have been the easiest response, and the one most foreman of that era would have instinctively reached for when faced with four exhausted men describing something that sounded like superstition or fatigue. He also didn't express the excitement that a genuine career-making discovery might have produced in a different man. Instead, he grew quiet. He turned the worked stone fragment over in his hands several times under the lamp on his desk. He asked a series of questions that suggested he was thinking less about the discovery itself and more about what it would mean for the daily operation of the mine. This reaction makes perfect sense once you understand the position the company was in that year. The shaft had already cost more than projected. The seam it was chasing had proven unpredictable and expensive, and the entire operation existed under constant pressure from the owners in Philadelphia to either produce results or justify its existence. A discovery like the one the four miners were describing represented, from a pure business standpoint, two simultaneous and contradictory problems. On one hand, if word of an ancient chamber beneath the property got out, it could attract the kind of attention, scientific and otherwise, that might delay operations indefinitely while researchers and government surveyors picked through ground the company needed to keep mining. On the other hand, if the company tried to seal the passage and pretend nothing had happened, and word leaked out anyway through the ordinary channels of small-town gossip, it would look evasive at best and guilty at worst. The foreman chose a third path, one that was neither full disclosure nor full suppression, but a careful, controlled middle ground that, in retrospect, ended up satisfying almost no one. He told the four men to say nothing to the rest of the crew beyond the fact that the blast had opened into what he called an unstable natural cavity, dangerous enough to warrant immediate sealing. This wasn't strictly a lie. since the chamber was genuinely unsurveyed and could have posed real dangers to men working without proper support. But it was also just as clearly a framing chosen specifically to discourage curiosity rather than to convey what the men had actually found. That very night, before the next shift began, a small crew under the foreman's direct supervision returned to the blast site and sealed the narrow passage with timber and loose rubble. It wasn't a full masonry wall, which would have required materials the company was not yet willing to commit, but it was enough of a barrier to keep anyone from wandering through by accident. The 4 original miners were reassigned to a different section of the operation within a week. The company's own ledgers record this as a routine reassignment, but at least one of the men later described it to a relative as something closer to being deliberately separated, kept too busy and too far apart to compare notes with each other or with anyone else. It would be easy, looking back from this distance, to read this entirely as a sinister cover-up, the kind of story we have all become accustomed to from powerful institutions protecting their financial interests at the expense of the truth. And there is good reason to believe that explanation captures a real part of what happened. But the full picture, as best as it can be reconstructed from the fragments that survive, is more complicated. The foreman didn't, as far as any record shows, attempt to destroy or dispose of the 2 objects the miners had brought up. Instead, he kept them in his office and then, within a few weeks, placed them in a small wooden box and sent them to a private contact of his outside the company. The identity of that contact is one of the frustrating gaps in this story. He is referred to in the one surviving letter connected to this exchange only by a surname that doesn't match any prominent geologist, archaeologist, or academic figure of the period. This contact appears to have had some background in what the letter vaguely describes as antiquarian interests, a catch-all term for the amateur collectors and self-taught scholars who operated largely outside the formal academic institutions of the time. This detail suggests that the foreman, whatever his motivations for keeping the company's official involvement minimal, was genuinely curious about what the men had found. He wanted an expert opinion, even if he was unwilling to pursue that opinion through official channels. The letter itself, dated several weeks after the discovery and preserved today only because it was tucked, apparently by accident, into the pages of an unrelated company ledger, is frustratingly brief. It describes the 2 objects in only the most general terms, referencing a worked stone fragment and what it calls, in language that has produced endless speculation, a small carved figure of uncertain material. It asks the recipient for his honest assessment of their age and origin. It closes with a line that has become, perhaps, the single most quoted sentence connected to the entire affair. The foreman wrote that he did not believe these objects had been carried into that chamber by any man currently living, or any man whose grandfather had lived. He said he would rather know the truth privately than have the company forced to explain it publicly before anyone understood what it actually meant. We do not have the response to that letter. If one was ever written, it has not survived or it has not yet been found. It could be sitting even now in some private collection or forgotten archive, waiting for the kind of accidental rediscovery that brought the original letter back into the light. What we do know is that within the year, the sealed passage in that Pennsylvania mine would be disturbed again. This time, it would not be by company employees under careful instruction, but by an outside party whose arrival in that small town marked the beginning of a much larger and much stranger chapter in this story. It involved, for the first time, people whose job it was to understand what lay beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, and whether the chamber those 4 exhausted miners had stumbled into was truly as isolated as everyone initially hoped. The man who arrived in town that following spring didn't announce himself as an investigator. In fact, the surviving accounts suggest he went to some lengths to appear as something else entirely, a buyer of mineral samples for an unnamed Eastern collector. This was a familiar figure in coal towns, a man who passed through with some regularity, purchasing unusual rock specimens, fossils, and occasional curiosities from miners willing to sell. This cover story, whether it was entirely fabricated or concealed a kernel of legitimate business, allowed him to move through the town and even into the company offices without raising the alarm an openly declared archaeologist or geologist might have triggered. His real name appears with reasonable consistency across the handful of sources that mention him, though even that name comes with some uncertainty, since at least one local account spells it slightly differently. What drew him to this particular town was almost certainly the letter the foreman had sent, or some version of the information that traced back to it. The antiquarian contact who received that letter appears to have shared its contents with a small network of like-minded private collectors who maintained a loose correspondence across the eastern United States, exchanging information about unusual finds the way modern collectors might share information today. Informally, enthusiastically, and largely outside the awareness of formal academic institutions. This informal network is enormously important for understanding how a discovery like this could generate real interest and still never make its way into any official record that survives. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, busy with its sweeping public survey of the mounds, operated according to careful procedures that left behind a paper trail. The private network of antiquarian collectors operated according to no such procedures at all. Letters were exchanged and sometimes destroyed. Objects were bought, sold, and traded among private hands with no record of where they had come from or where they eventually ended up. It was in effect a parallel system of knowledge transmission, running alongside the official one, faster in some ways, less reliable in others, and almost entirely invisible to anyone looking back at this period using only the official archive. The man who arrived in town that spring spent nearly 2 weeks there before he made any direct approach to the mine itself. He spent that time doing exactly what his cover story suggested, visiting local farms and the homes of several miners known to keep small collections of interesting rock specimens. This wasn't entirely a pretense. He genuinely did purchase several specimens, and at least 2 of these transactions are documented in the account books kept by the sellers. It was during this period of casual collecting that he made contact with one of the 4 original miners, not the oldest of the group, but one of the younger men who had been present at the discovery. This younger miner had grown visibly restless with the company's insistence on silence. The exact circumstances of the contact remain unclear. Whether the investigators sought him out specifically using information from the original letter, or whether the young miner, frustrated and curious, approached him after recognizing an opportunity to discuss what he had seen with someone who seemed genuinely interested, rather than merely concerned with liability and production schedules. Whatever the initiating circumstance, the conversation that followed produced the most detailed surviving description of the chamber's interior from anyone who was actually present during the original discovery. The investigator, evidently a careful and methodical interviewer despite his casual cover, walked the young miner through his memory of the event multiple times, comparing details across retellings to identify which elements remained consistent and which shifted. A technique that mirrors exactly the kind of careful witness interviewing that modern investigators are taught to use. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of the chamber considerably more detailed than the brief second-hand accounts that had previously circulated. The young miner described additional details he hadn't initially mentioned to the foreman, including the suggestion that the floor of the chamber, beneath the loose surface rubble, seemed in places to be deliberately leveled. It was flat in a way that natural cave floors at that depth almost never are. Along one section of wall, just at the edge of where his lamp had been able to reach, there were marks that looked like they had been made on purpose, not by water and not by the blast, but by human hands a very long time ago. This is the detail, more than any single object, that convinced the investigator he had stumbled on as something worth pursuing seriously. Worked stone fragments, however unusual, could in theory be explained away by conventional means. Items carried in by earlier indigenous visitors to a cave mouth that might have existed near the surface before later collapse sealed it off, or objects that had simply washed into the chamber from elsewhere through some long-forgotten natural process. But deliberate markings on a wall in a chamber that showed no natural opening to the surface suggested something harder to dismiss. Someone had been inside that space, by some entrance long since closed off and forgotten. They had spent enough time there to leave a mark that survived, apparently undisturbed, until four exhausted Pennsylvania coal miners broke through a wall and found it waiting for them in the dark. Having gathered this much, the investigator faced a difficult problem. The chamber itself remained sealed behind the barrier the foreman's crew had erected the previous year, deep inside an active mine. He had no legitimate reason to enter it, and every reason to believe the company would refuse to let him near it. His notes from this period reveal a man weighing several possible approaches, each with obvious risks, before settling on the simplest and most consequential one. He approached the foreman directly. This decision deserves some attention, because on its surface it seems like the move that should have ended his investigation immediately. The foreman had spent the better part of a year keeping this discovery quiet. Why would he suddenly cooperate with a stranger who arrived asking pointed questions about the very thing he had gone to such lengths to bury? The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from the fragments of correspondence that survive, comes back to that letter the foreman had written, the one expressing genuine private curiosity and a clear preference for understanding the truth quietly. The investigator, it turns out, did not arrive as a stranger making a cold approach. He arrived carrying a letter of introduction from the very antiquarian contact the foreman had originally written to, the man whose identity remains one of this story's gaps. With that introduction in hand, the foreman's resistance dissolved with surprising speed. The two men met privately on more than one occasion over the following week. During these meetings, the foreman shared the surviving correspondence connected to the discovery and eventually agreed to arrange a return visit to the sealed chamber itself under conditions of strict secrecy. This return expedition took place in the early summer of 1892, just over a year after the original discovery. The crew was small, for men beyond the investigator and the foreman himself, including the young miner and one other member of the original group. The oldest miner had left the company entirely for reasons the surviving records don't explain. They worked at night, after the regular shift had ended, using lanterns rather than the open-flame oil lamps. The timber barrier sealing the passage came apart with relative ease, and the narrow passage beyond appeared exactly as it had been left. What the investigator recorded upon entering the larger chamber represents the most detailed and systematic description of the space that exists anywhere in the historical record connected to this story. He measured what he could with a length of marked cord he had brought specifically for this purpose. The chamber was roughly 40 feet across at its widest point, though he was careful to note that the irregular shape made any single measurement misleading. The chamber seemed to extend further in at least two directions than his cord or his lantern light could confirm. The ceiling, he noted with evident surprise, was higher than he expected, in places reaching well above where a man could touch. This detail mattered because it meant the space couldn't be easily explained as a low, cramped natural cavity. The floor matched the young miner's description closely, flat in long sections beneath a thin scattering of loose debris that appeared, upon careful brushing aside, to be largely composed of small fragments of the same worked stone material the original miners had recovered. A natural collapse would be expected to scatter fragments of the local bedrock, rather than fragments that consistently matched the worked, grooved material. The implication was that whatever structure had originally produced that worked stone material had partially collapsed or been deliberately broken apart within the chamber itself. It was while examining this debris field that the investigator and the young miner together located the wall the miner had described. What they found there, illuminated by steady lamplight, would become the most debated detail in this story. The wall, according to the investigator's careful description, ran for a length of about 12 feet, curving slightly inward as it rose. Across a section of it, roughly from waist height to shoulder height, the surface had been worked. The marks were shallow, almost delicate, a series of grooves and lines that, taken individually, might easily be dismissed as incidental scratching. But taken together, arranged across that span, they formed patterns that repeated, that echoed each other in spacing and depth in a way that pure geological accident should not reliably produce. He described what appeared to be parallel vertical lines grouped in clusters, interspersed with curving marks that didn't match the vertical groupings in style. It suggested either two different methods of marking the stone or two different sets of marks made at different times, possibly by different hands. Toward one end, the marks became denser and more deliberate, clustering into a form that the investigator described as resembling, in the crudest and most general sense, the outline of a figure. He was careful to qualify this heavily, noting that he couldn't be certain whether he was looking at a deliberate representation or simply allowing his mind, after hours underground in flickering light, to impose a recognizable shape onto an abstract pattern. This kind of careful self-doubt is one of the details that has made this story persist. People who fabricate discoveries tend not to leave behind hedged language questioning their own perceptions. They tend toward confident, vivid description. Beyond the marked wall, the investigator's notes describe locating several more worked stone fragments, along with one additional object that does not appear in any earlier account. It was a small object, roughly 6 inches in length, made from a material he could not confidently identify by sight alone. He noted that it did not appear to be the same stone as the surrounding chamber walls, suggesting it had been brought into the space rather than fashioned from material found there. The shape narrowed at one end into a point, though not sharp enough to function as a weapon in any straightforward sense, while the opposite end widened into a shape he compared to the handle of a tool meant to be gripped. This object has become the subject of intense speculation, because it does not closely match any known tool type from any confirmed pre-Columbian culture in the eastern woodlands. This single fact is what has kept this story circulating in certain corners of alternative history for well over a century. It is worth pausing here to be direct and honest. An object not matching any known tool type does not mean it is necessarily ancient, mysterious, or evidence of some unknown culture. It could just as easily mean the object was poorly described by an untrained observer working in dim light. It could mean the object was damaged or partial. It could even mean, and this possibility deserves to be taken seriously, that the object was never genuinely ancient at all, but was something more recent, perhaps even something deliberately placed in that chamber by someone for reasons we can no longer reconstruct. The investigator himself, to his credit, raised something close to this possibility in his own notes. He noted that the chamber, while showing no obvious natural opening to the surface, had not been fully mapped. He couldn't entirely rule out some unknown access point, perhaps long collapsed or deliberately concealed, through which more recent visitors might have entered. This admission, buried in his private notes, represents the kind of intellectual honesty that makes this case frustrating in the best possible way. There is no smoking gun here, no single piece of evidence that settles the matter definitively in either direction. What there is instead is a careful, detailed, genuinely puzzled account from a man with real experience handling archaeological material. He described a space and a set of objects that he himself could not confidently place into any category he already understood. The chamber, he was beginning to suspect, extended considerably further than the section his lantern had managed to reach. He had noticed, while moving along the far edge of the chamber opposite from where the original blast had broken through. A section of wall where the smooth worked quality of the stone continued past the point where the open chamber space seemed to end. It suggested another passage, similar in character to the one the original miners had walked through, leading further into the hillside. He did not attempt to explore this second passage that night. The expedition had already run long. The small crew was exhausted, and the foreman was anxious about the risk of their absence being noticed. The investigator reluctantly agreed to seal the passage and return another night, properly equipped. This return expedition took longer to organize than either man anticipated. The foreman faced increasing pressure from the company's regional office regarding the shaft's continued underperformance. He had less and less time and resources to quietly redirect toward an unofficial archaeological investigation. It wasn't until early autumn of 1892 that conditions finally aligned for a second expedition. The crew this time was slightly larger, 6 men beyond the investigator and the foreman. The young miner remained part of the group, now functioning more as an informal guide. The second passage, once they reached it, proved narrower than the first, narrow enough in places that the men had to proceed single file. But it was unmistakably similar in character. The same smooth worked stone surface, the same absence of rough texture. The investigator's notes record a growing sense, shared by every man in the group, that they were walking through something built rather than simply discovered. A structure whose original purpose and whose builders remained entirely unknown, but whose deliberate construction was no longer in doubt. This second passage ran, by the investigator's careful measurement, for nearly 200 feet. Along the way, it curved gently in at least 2 places. At the end of this passage, the group encountered a second chamber, smaller than the first, but in his assessment considerably more clearly a product of deliberate construction. The walls showed clear evidence of having been shaped into regular rectangular niches, set into the surrounding stone at intervals. The niches varied somewhat in size, but consistently maintained roughly the same proportions, suggesting a standardized purpose. It was within several of these niches that the group made the discovery that would prove to be the most consequential of the entire investigation. What they found resting within those niches was not stone, and was not any mineral specimen any of them had encountered before. The investigator's notes described the contents of the first niche as a collection of what he initially took for ordinary bones. Closer examination revealed something more puzzling. The objects were bone, or at least appeared to be composed of a material with the general weight and texture of bone. But they had been shaped deliberately, with evident skill, into forms that did not correspond to any natural anatomical structure. Several of these worked bone objects were tube-shaped, hollow along their length, with a series of small holes drilled at irregular intervals along one side. This description drew an immediate and excited comparison to musical instruments, specifically the kind of bone flutes now recognized as among the oldest known musical instruments crafted by early human populations. This comparison represents one of the more genuinely startling implications of this entire story. If the objects truly were musical instruments, deliberately shaped and drilled, resting in carefully carved niches within a structure that showed no evidence of any natural opening to the surface, then the question of who made them, and one becomes very difficult to answer through any conventional historical framework. Other niches, according to his room-by-room notation, contained different materials. At least 2 held fragments of a dark fibrous material that crumbled slightly when handled, which he speculated might represent the remains of woven plant fiber. A third niche, positioned slightly apart in a section of the wall that seemed to have received more careful shaping, contained the single largest object recovered during either expedition. A roughly oval-shaped item about 14 inches at its longest point, made of a material neither stone nor bone nor any metal he recognized. It had a smooth, almost glassy surface texture in places, interrupted by patches that felt rougher, almost fibrous. This object has become the subject of the most intense and frustrating speculation, precisely because the investigator's own description doesn't provide enough information to confidently identify what it was made from. This absence of the actual physical object from modern scientific analysis sits at the heart of why this story occupies such a frustrating position. We have what appears to be a genuine, good faith account from a man with real practical experience, describing a discovery that would be of considerable significance to our understanding of pre-Columbian human presence in this region. But we have no surviving physical evidence that modern carbon dating or material analysis could apply to settle the matter. What we do have, continuing the thread of this story, is the investigator's account of what happened after this second expedition concluded, an account that becomes increasingly focused on a growing concern about how long this discovery could remain contained, and what might happen once the containment began to fail. That failure didn't arrive through any dramatic betrayal. It came through the simple impossibility of 6 men working an unusual secretive night shift without someone eventually noticing and asking questions. The first crack appeared when one of the men mentioned, apparently in a moment of exhaustion at the company store, that he had seen something underground that no church and no school book had ever prepared him to understand. This kind of vague comment, the kind a tired man might make without intending to reveal anything specific, is exactly the kind of seed from which rumor grows. And grow it did. Within weeks, a version of the story was circulating that bore only a loose resemblance to the investigator's careful notes. A version involving everything from buried treasure to the bones of giants to an entire underground city. This exaggeration represents one of the most significant obstacles facing anyone who tries to separate what actually happened from what later embellishment added. The investigator recognized this danger immediately, writing that he feared the genuine significance of what they had found would be buried beneath layers of exaggeration and disbelief. His fear proved well-founded. The exaggerated rumors didn't immediately attract serious scientific attention. What they attracted instead was the attention of a regional newspaper editor who had built a reputation on stories of exactly this flavor. The editor dispatched a young reporter to find out what the miners were saying and write it up, regardless of whether it could be confirmed. The reporter, denied access to the mine itself, constructed his article primarily from second-hand accounts, local rumor, and fragments of the wilder folklore. The resulting piece bore even less resemblance to the investigator's notes than the local rumors. It described an underground temple of an ancient and forgotten race, complete with treasure chambers and evidence of human sacrifice, a detail that appears nowhere in the investigator's actual notes and has no basis in anything the original miners reported. This single article, sensational and largely fabricated, did more damage to the story's credibility than any cover-up ever managed. It gave the entire affair, in the eyes of any serious scientist, the unmistakable flavor of a fabricated treasure story. It is one of the bitter ironies of this account that the company's careful attempt to manage the discovery quietly may have inadvertently protected the credibility of what the original investigator actually documented. By preventing direct access, they kept a journalist from either confirming or debunking the rumors. Instead, the story split from this point forward into 2 threads: the careful, hedged account preserved in the investigator's private notes, and the increasingly exaggerated folk version that spread through newspapers and oral storytelling. The newspaper article itself produced exactly the reaction within the company's regional offices that anyone familiar with their profit-focused culture would predict. Senior management reacted with alarm, not because they believed the sensational claims, but because the publicity, regardless of its accuracy, threatened to bring outside attention and operational disruption. The response was swift and thorough. Within weeks, the company authorized a permanent sealing of the entire section of the mine containing both chambers. They used not a temporary timber barrier, but a substantial poured concrete and masonry wall, an expense significant enough to require direct approval from the board. The official justification cited structural instability, language that, taken at face value, sounds like a reasonable safety decision. It is entirely possible this justification reflected genuine concerns, since the chambers were unsurveyed ancient excavations sitting beneath an active industrial mining operation. The company's actions are consistent with both a genuine concern for safety and a deliberate effort to bury an inconvenient discovery. The surviving record does not clearly distinguish between these motivations, and it is entirely possible both were operating simultaneously. What we do know is that the investigator was given no warning of the decision and learned of it only after the work had been completed. This detail matters because it means that whatever additional examination he might have hoped to conduct was foreclosed entirely. His notes from the two expeditions remain the only detailed first-hand documentation of the chamber's interior that exists in any form. The letter in which the investigator describes learning of the permanent ceiling carries a tone notably different from his usual measured prose. It is genuinely bitter, expressing frustration not merely at losing access, but at what he called a willful blindness on the part of institutions more interested in coal tonnage than in understanding what might be the single most significant archaeological discovery made in that region in living memory. His attempts to bring the matter to wider attention through official channels, addressed to figures connected with the Smithsonian survey, met with cautious, non-committal responses. They requested documentation he was unable to provide. This response reflects something important about how institutional science actually operates. A private collector's second-hand account of an inaccessible site, however detailed, does not carry the same weight as a properly documented excavation. The researchers at the Smithsonian, already managing a contentious public debate, had little appetite for chasing an unverifiable claim. With the official channels closed and the chamber sealed, the story might easily have ended there. That it didn't end quite so cleanly owes something to the subsequent lives of the men who had been present. The original discoverer remained with the company for several years, working well away from the sealed area. He said remarkably little about what he had seen, far less than the rumors might have suggested. This relative silence stands in contrast to the younger miner who had become the investigator's primary source. It suggests whatever the original discoverer experienced affected him in a more private way. What we do have is a brief account he gave late in his life to a grandchild. It was an account that would go on to be shared with the regional folklorist. This account, second-hand and filtered through decades, contains details that align with the investigator's notes, suggesting a genuine continuity of memory rather than invention. According to this account, the miner described the moment of breaking through, not primarily in terms of fear, but as a feeling closer to recognition, an unsettling sense that he had walked into somewhere he was not supposed to find, but that had been waiting for exactly this kind of accidental discovery. This detail has become one of the most frequently quoted elements of the story, precisely because it captures something the sensational newspaper version fails to convey. It was the genuinely strange, unresolved quality of the actual lived experience as described by the one person who was there from the very first moment. A man who carried something he never fully processed and never fully shared, not out of secrecy, but out of an inability to find adequate words for an experience that didn't fit neatly into any framework. The miner died in the early decades of the 20th century, having never returned to the section of the mine where the discovery occurred. The shaft itself was eventually abandoned and allowed to flood and collapse. This final detail matters enormously for understanding why this story occupies such a frustrating position today. The chamber, if it survives at all after a century of water intrusion, sits somewhere beneath ground that is no longer safely accessible. Any modern attempt to verify this story would require resources and specialized expertise that no individual researcher and no institution has yet committed. This is where the verifiable historical thread largely runs out, leaving a fascinating collection of partial evidence. An investigator's careful private notes, a handful of letters and company records, a sensationalized newspaper account that damaged the story's credibility, and a body of local folklore that preserves fragments of genuine memory tangled with inevitable exaggeration. But to understand why this story has continued to surface every few decades, it helps to look at the broader pattern it fits into. A pattern that appears with surprising frequency throughout the buried history of pre-Columbian North America. The same decades that saw coal companies pushing deeper shafts also saw railroad crews blasting through mountain passes, canal diggers cutting new waterways, and farmers plowing fields that had sat untouched for centuries. Each of these activities, conducted at a pace the 19th century had never attempted, occasionally and unavoidably broke into ground that held evidence of much older human activity. The pattern that emerges from looking at these scattered incidents together is consistent. Railroad workers in West Virginia reportedly broke into a chamber containing unusual skeletal remains that were briefly described and then lost. Diggers in Ohio struck a stone shaft extending below any depth conventional well-digging techniques were thought to reach. These incidents, taken individually, suffer from the same evidentiary problems that plague our Pennsylvania case. But taken together, as a pattern repeating across multiple states and decades, they paint a picture of a continent whose pre-Columbian human history was already substantially damaged by the time serious archaeology developed the tools to study it properly. The earthworks scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, structures like the Great Serpent Mound or the geometrically precise enclosures at Newark, Ohio, represent engineering and organizational achievements that required coordinated labor, astronomical knowledge, and long-term planning. Modern archaeology has confirmed these achievements. The Newark earthworks, to take one well-documented example, incorporate precise astronomical alignments connected to the complex 18.6-year cycle of the moon's rising and setting. Identifying and encoding such a subtle cycle into a permanent earthwork would have required generations of careful astronomical observation. This is the context into which the Pennsylvania discovery emerged. A context where the actual scale of pre-Columbian achievement was being documented by serious researchers, even as a popular culture and political establishment had every motivation to minimize it. A genuinely significant archaeological discovery made by working miners with no formal training and investigated by an amateur antiquarian stood almost no chance of receiving the attention that might have settled its significance. Given everything we have walked through, it is worth considering the range of explanations serious researchers have proposed for what that chamber might have been. The most straightforward explanation, favored by most professional archaeologists, holds that it was a previously undocumented indigenous ceremonial or burial site. It was constructed by ancestors of the historic tribes who inhabited this region before European contact, groups connected to the broader Susquehannock and related Iroquoian-speaking peoples. This explanation fits comfortably with several of the most well-corroborated details. The worked stone fragments, the apparent musical instruments, the deliberate construction. What made the chamber unusual was not that it represented something impossible, but that it happened to be located at a depth that created a dramatic impression of a structure existing impossibly deep underground. Under this theory, it may have originally been a surface or near-surface structure that had simply been buried by geological processes over the centuries. This explanation, reasonable as it is, leaves certain details uncomfortably unresolved, particularly the unidentified tool-like object and the large, oval object of uncertain material. Proponents of this explanation respond by pointing out that the historical record remains incomplete. Unidentified objects from undocumented sites are not strong evidence of something more exotic than the simple fact that our knowledge of pre-Columbian material culture is far from complete. A second explanation, considerably more speculative, proposes that the chamber may represent evidence of a considerably older human presence in this region than the conventional archaeological timeline allows. This connects to a genuinely active debate about exactly when and how the Americas were first populated. The conventional Clovis first model, which held that humans first entered the continent around 13,000 years ago, has been seriously challenged by evidence suggesting considerably earlier presence, in some cases potentially extending back 20,000 years or more. If a chamber like the one described did contain evidence connected to this older period, the unusual character of certain objects becomes somewhat more explicable. We would be dealing with material culture from a period so early and so poorly documented that almost any object recovered might reasonably fail to match familiar comparative frameworks. It is important to state plainly that this second explanation remains more speculative than the first. The honest position is that the surviving evidence does not allow for a confident resolution between these competing explanations. A third category of explanation has attached itself to this story over the decades, particularly within alternative history discussion. It encompasses claims of a lost technologically advanced civilization, or, in the most extreme versions, evidence of non-human influence. These claims have no credible support in the actual surviving historical record. The investigators' notes describe objects and structures that, while puzzling, fall well within the range of what a careful observer might describe when encountering an unfamiliar but fundamentally human-made archaeological site. Nothing in the surviving record describes technology or materials that exceed what we know human societies were genuinely capable of producing. This is worth dwelling on because it illustrates something important about how stories like this evolve in wider circulation. The genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain core of the story, an unusual archaeological discovery made under difficult conditions, investigated informally by a careful amateur, and sealed away before proper scientific documentation could occur, gets progressively replaced by a version optimized for dramatic impact. The 1893 newspaper needed to sell copies to readers who cared more about being entertained than about being accurately informed. The later alternative history writers needed content dramatic enough to sustain reader interest. And content created for platforms like this one faced some version of the same pressure. Having said all of this, it would be dishonest to pretend the genuine uncertainty at the core of this story is less worth our attention than the exaggerated versions. A real archaeological discovery made under genuinely difficult conditions, investigated by a man wrestling honestly with the limits of his own perception, and ultimately sealed away before any properly trained researcher had the opportunity to study it, is a genuinely remarkable story entirely on its own merits. This brings us to the more recent chapter of this story. The efforts a small handful of researchers have made over the past several decades to determine what can still be verified. The most serious of these efforts was undertaken by an independent historian who spent the better part of a decade attempting to reconstruct the precise location using surviving company maps, geological surveys, and modern mine subsidence records. His research succeeded in narrowing down the likely location of the original shaft to a specific area. He was careful to note that the surviving maps are not perfectly reliable. What he was able to establish with greater confidence, using state monitoring data, is that the area has experienced significant groundwater flooding. State data indicates water levels have risen to a point that would place the depth of the original chamber well below the current water table. This finding carries discouraging implications for the possibility of any future direct investigation, since accessing a flooded underground space requires specialized techniques and institutional support that has never been secured for this case. The same researcher made one further discovery. While searching the records of the Regional Historical Society, he located a previously uncatalogued box of materials donated by a descendant of the original investigator. It contains several additional pages of the investigator's notes that had not previously been known to exist. These additional pages don't provide any dramatic new revelation, but they offer a final glimpse into how the investigator himself came to understand what he believed he had witnessed. In these later pages, he writes with a tone of resigned acceptance rather than active investigation. He acknowledges he never succeeded in obtaining expert confirmation. His attempts to interest proper scientific institutions had come to nothing. The permanent sealing of the chamber had settled the matter, as far as the world at large would ever be concerned, regardless of what he personally continued to believe. But he also writes that he did not regret his efforts, because he had been permitted to see something that very few men of his era would ever have the opportunity to witness. This sentiment captures something that runs through this entire story. The investigator was attempting to practice something close to genuine archaeology, decades before the institutional infrastructure that would make rigorous archaeology possible across the broader landscape had fully developed. He simply lacked the resources, the institutional support, and ultimately the access. The chamber was sealed away before any of these missing pieces could be supplied. It is worth sitting with the genuine sadness embedded in that outcome. A man spent real time and resources trying to understand something significant, working largely alone against institutional indifference. In the end, the world he was trying to inform simply moved on without him, more interested in the coal that could be extracted than in whatever older human story might have been buried alongside it. If you have found yourself drawn into this story tonight, it is worth widening our view once more to consider how this single case connects to a much larger thread that runs throughout the buried history of the American landscape. A thread that researchers specializing in what is sometimes called forbidden archaeology have spent decades trying to trace. Consider the case of the so-called giant skeletons that appears with startling regularity in regional newspaper archives throughout the 19th century in states from Ohio to Tennessee. These accounts suffer from the same evidentiary weaknesses as our Pennsylvania case. Mainstream archaeology has generally concluded that these accounts most likely reflect misidentification, the psychological tendency for excavated bones to appear larger than they actually are, and deliberate hoaxing. But the sheer volume and geographic spread of these accounts, each individually weak as evidence, but collectively suggesting some underlying pattern of unusual discoveries, mirrors almost exactly the pattern we have traced. A genuine phenomenon, whatever its actual underlying explanation, encountering a society that lacked both the institutional infrastructure and the cultural motivation to investigate it properly. This same pattern recurs in the case of the so-called Michigan relics, a large collection of inscribed clay and slate tablets recovered from sites across southern Michigan beginning in the 1890s. This particular case was eventually subjected to thorough scientific scrutiny. The consensus concluded that the vast majority represented a deliberate and surprisingly elaborate hoax. The Michigan relics case is worth including because it illustrates the other side of the coin. Not every claim from this chaotic era represents a genuine archaeological find. Some represent deliberate fabrication. Distinguishing between genuine discoveries and deliberate hoaxes requires the kind of careful, skeptical analysis that the Michigan relics eventually received, and that the Pennsylvania Chamber, sealed away before any comparable scientific examination could occur, never had the opportunity to receive at all. This is, in the end, perhaps the single most important honest conclusion this story can offer. The Pennsylvania discovery occupies a frustrating middle position between cases like the well-documented mound complexes at Newark, Ohio, which modern archaeology has confirmed, and cases like the Michigan relics, which careful examination has revealed to be deliberate fabrication. We simply do not, and very likely never will have enough surviving physical evidence to confidently place the Pennsylvania Chamber into either category. What we have instead is a careful reconstruction of what can actually be verified from the surviving record, presented alongside an honest accounting of where that record runs out. The chamber may have contained evidence of a sophisticated, previously undocumented indigenous ceremonial tradition. It may have contained evidence connected to the genuinely unresolved debate over exactly how early humans first arrived in the Americas. It may have contained material that careful modern analysis would identify as considerably more mundane. We do not know. The company's decision to seal that chamber away permanently beneath concrete and rising groundwater means we may genuinely never know. Not because the truth is being actively suppressed by any ongoing conspiracy, but because the simple combination of commercial indifference, institutional limitation, and geological time has already closed the door. There is one further dimension of this story worth sitting with carefully. It concerns the way 19th century mining companies across the entire Appalachian coal belt handled the question of what to do when their operations encountered anything unusual underground. The pattern that emerges from company records across this period suggests that what happened beneath our central Pennsylvania town was not an isolated approach, but rather a fairly standard institutional response. The guiding principle was containment rather than investigation. The assumption that anything unusual encountered during excavation represented first and foremost a potential liability and a distraction from the core business. This is not a surprising philosophy for profit-driven enterprises to hold. But understanding this pattern helps explain why our discovery followed almost exactly the same trajectory as so many similar incidents scattered across the historical record. Brief initial interest, an attempt at quiet and formal investigation, and then eventual permanent sealing. This pattern repeated itself with such consistency that historians who specialize in Appalachian mining have given it informal recognition as a recurring feature, even though the specific details of any individual incident rarely survive. It is worth considering too how this pattern intersects with the broader labor conditions that define mining work. Conditions that placed enormous pressure on individual miners to avoid exactly the kind of behavior that our central figures found themselves drawn toward, despite the risks to their employment. Mining work offered little job security and even less protection for workers who deviated from expected behavior. The willingness of at least two men connected to this story, the young miner who continued sharing details and the investigator who persisted in his informal research, represents a notable departure from what the economic incentives predicted. This departure deserves to be understood as a form of genuine intellectual courage, even though none of the people involved would likely have described their own actions in such terms. They were driven by something closer to simple, stubborn human curiosity, the kind of curiosity that persists even when every practical incentive points toward letting a mystery go unexamined. The kind that has throughout human history occasionally produced genuine contributions to our collective understanding, even when it emerges from people who possess no formal credentials. This is perhaps one final thread to carry forward: the recognition that history's most significant discoveries don't always arrive through careful, well-funded channels. Sometimes they arrive through the accidental intersection of ordinary working people doing ordinary jobs, who happen to encounter something extraordinary and choose, against considerable practical pressure, to pay attention to what they have found. And yet, even accepting this uncertainty, there remains something genuinely worth reflecting on in how thoroughly this single incident illustrates a much larger truth about the relationship between American industrial expansion and the deeper human history of the continent it was built upon. Consider the scale of underground disruption the late 19th and early 20th centuries represented. Thousands of mine shafts driven into hillsides, tens of thousands of miles of railroad cuts blasted through mountain ranges. Countless wells, canals, and foundation excavations dug into ground that had supported continuous human habitation for thousands of years. Each one of these projects represented a moment of risk and opportunity for exactly the kind of accidental encounter this story has traced. And the overwhelming majority of these encounters, when they occurred at all, almost certainly played out in the same manner. An untrained worker encountering something unusual, a brief flurry of local curiosity, and then a quiet, practical decision driven by commercial necessity to continue the original project. This is not evidence of some grand, coordinated conspiracy. The pattern this story illustrates is considerably more mundane and in some ways more disturbing precisely because of that mundanity. No single organization needed to coordinate the suppression of pre-Columbian history. The basic economic logic of industrial capitalism combined with cultural indifference was entirely sufficient to produce this outcome. The danger is not that some secret cabal is actively hiding evidence. The actual danger, the one this story illustrates with genuine and lasting significance, is that an entire society organized its priorities in a way that consistently destroyed or buried evidence of its own deeper history. Not through deliberate malice in most individual cases, but through the simple effect of treating economic development as more valuable than historical preservation. The genuine tragedy embedded in this story is not that some specific secret was deliberately hidden, but that an entire category of knowledge, the accumulated material evidence of thousands of years of human habitation across this continent, was allowed to be destroyed piece by piece, simply because nobody with the power to stop it had sufficient motivation to do so. As we settle now into the later hours of this story, it is worth returning one final time to the human scale of everything we have walked through tonight. Away from the broader patterns of industrial expansion and institutional indifference, back to the four men who stood at the edge of that opening on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1891. Their lamps throwing small circles of light into a darkness that had been waiting undisturbed for longer than any of them could have imagined. They were not scholars. They were working men doing a dangerous and exhausting job in pursuit of modest wages that kept their families fed in a hard, unforgiving company town. The discovery that found them, rather than the other way around, asked something of them that their lives had never prepared them to provide. And yet, in their own halting, uncertain way, they rose to meet it. The oldest among them recognized, with the quiet wisdom of 30 years underground, that this was beyond his authority to handle alone. He made the difficult choice to retreat rather than push forward into danger that exceeded his ability to manage safely. The younger miner, restless and curious, found the willingness to keep talking, keep remembering, keep sharing what he had seen with someone genuinely interested, even when the company made clear that silence was the safer path. And the original discoverer, the man whose pick first broke through into that ancient waiting darkness, carried what he had experienced quietly across the remainder of a long life, never quite finding the words to fully explain it, but never entirely letting it go either, until finally he offered a grandchild a brief glimpse of what that moment had actually felt like. There is something genuinely moving when you sit with it long enough in recognizing how much of what we know about this affair survives. Not because any official institution recognized its importance and took steps to preserve it, but because a series of individual people made an individual, largely unrewarded choice to care about preserving something that the larger institutions and economic forces had already decided was not worth the trouble. This pattern, repeated at every level, suggests something quietly hopeful buried within an otherwise frustrating account. The truth, or as much of the truth as we are ever likely to recover, survives at all only because individual people, working largely alone and without any official mandate, simply refuse to let it disappear entirely. If you find yourself in these quiet hours thinking about the ground beneath your own feet, that instinct is worth following for a moment before sleep. Nearly everywhere across this continent, beneath the foundations of houses, beneath the asphalt of roads, there exists the accumulated physical residue of thousands of years of human presence. layer upon layer of habitation, ceremony, daily life, and burial, stretching back far further than the history that fills most American classrooms. Most of it will never be found, not because anyone is actively hiding it, but because the patient, ordinary business of living rarely pauses long enough to look carefully at what lies beneath. There is, in this thought, both something unsettling and strangely comforting. Unsettling, because it means an enormous amount of genuine human history has likely already been lost forever, destroyed not through catastrophe, but through the slow, mundane processes of farming, building, and digging that every generation has carried out without a second thought for what might lie beneath. But comforting, too, because it means the ground still holds far more than we know. The story of this continent remains in some genuine and meaningful sense unfinished, still capable of producing new discoveries, new fragments, new unexpected breakthroughs into spaces that have been quietly waiting for someone to finally notice them. The four miners who stood at that opening in 1891 did not set out looking for any of this. They were looking for coal, the same ordinary, practical, economically necessary substance that had defined their working lives. What they found instead, whatever its ultimate nature, was a reminder, delivered entirely by accident, that the ground beneath even the most ordinary corners of this country can still hold something extraordinary. Something that connects the hurried industrial present of blast furnaces and breaker towers directly back to a much older, much quieter human story that the modern world had, by 1891, almost entirely forgotten how to listen for. Let us return now briefly to that ridge mentioned earlier. The same rocky, difficult ground that the area's earliest farmers had quietly avoided for generations before the coal company ever arrived. The same ridge whose hollow drum-like quality and faint unexplained lights had passed down through local memory long before anyone connected it to what would eventually be found in the valley below. According to the earliest documentation the folklorist was able to locate, the caution surrounding that ridge predated not just the mining operation, but the very earliest European settlement of the area entirely. Several of his interview subjects recalled their grandparents describing conversations, held sometime in the early 19th century, with members of the indigenous community who had remained in the region. These conversations suggested that the indigenous residents themselves understood the ridge as a place that had been avoided for reasons connected to inherited tradition for as long as anyone could recall. This detail, fragile and heavily filtered through multiple generations of oral transmission, as it admittedly is, carries genuine weight. It suggests, if taken seriously, that the avoidance surrounding the ridge was not simply a reaction to the 1891 discovery, but represented a genuinely older tradition. The folklorist himself, careful and appropriately cautious, declined to draw any firm conclusion about what this tradition meant. He noted reasonably that traditions of avoiding specific places are common across countless indigenous communities. But he also noted, with what reads as genuine scholarly fascination, that the specific correspondence between this older tradition and the precise location where the discovery eventually occurred was a correlation worth taking seriously. This thread, the quiet, multi-generational indigenous memory of a place worth avoiding, sitting directly above ground that 19th century industrial miners would eventually breach by accident in pursuit of coal, adds one final layer of genuine, unresolved mystery. It suggests, however speculatively, that the people who actually knew this landscape best may have carried forward, across countless generations of careful oral tradition, an awareness of something significant beneath that ridge that the rest of the world would not stumble into until a hot Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1891. Before we move toward the close of tonight's story, it is worth slowing down and spending some time inside the texture of daily life in that coal town. Because understanding the rhythm of that world helps us understand how disruptive and genuinely disorienting their discovery must have felt. The working day in a town like this began long before dawn. particularly in the winter months, when the men needed to be at the shaft entrance, lamps lit and ready, well before the first hint of gray light touched the sky. Breakfast was a quick, practical affair. Thick bread, sometimes with a thin spread of lard or molasses, washed down with strong, cheap coffee. The walk to the shaft entrance rarely took more than 15 or 20 minutes, but it was a walk conducted in near silence, men saving their breath and energy for the work ahead. The descent into the mine itself, accomplished by a cage system lowered on cables that groaned and rattled, took the workers down through layers of rock that grew progressively older and stranger the deeper they went. Once at the working face, the actual labor involved a combination of skilled handwork and mechanical and explosive assistance. A skilled miner would examine the coal face carefully before beginning work, reading the seam for weaknesses and natural fracture lines. Drilling holes for blasting charges required precision. After a blast, the real physical labor began, loading the broken coal by hand into small carts. Work that demanded sustained physical exertion in cramped, often barely lit conditions. This was the unglamorous, exhausting reality of anthracite mining in 1891. A reality that makes the discovery even more remarkable when you consider that it interrupted exactly this kind of grinding, repetitive physical labor, transforming an ordinary workday into something that none of the men involved would ever fully process or forget. The end of a shift brought its own particular rhythm, the ascent back to the surface, the brief moment of removing a lamp that had been clipped to a cap for 10 or 12 hours. And then, for most men, a walk to the company store to purchase provisions, often on credit against future wages. A detail that matters for understanding why the four miners would have had practical reasons to be cautious about anything that might jeopardize their continued employment. Evenings followed their own quiet pattern. Families gathered around whatever modest heat source the household could afford. Children doing whatever schoolwork was available. Adults exhausted from the day's labor, retiring early in preparation for the same demanding routine that would begin again before the next dawn. It was within this rhythm that our story's central discovery occurred. A single extraordinary interruption breaking through the sameness of industrial labor in a way that none of the men could have anticipated. It is worth pausing to consider the genuinely staggering depth of time represented by the rock these men spent their lives cutting through. The anthracite coal of northeastern Pennsylvania did not form quickly, and it did not form recently. The organic material began accumulating, according to geologists, during the Carboniferous period, an era that drew to a close roughly 300 million years before any human being walked upright. During that period, the landscape looked nothing like the rolling hills familiar to anyone who has visited the region today. It existed as a vast, low-lying coastal swamp choked with primitive plant life entirely unlike anything alive on Earth today. As these ancient swamp forests grew and died generation after generation across millions of years, their remains accumulated in thick layers. Over time, the immense pressure and heat generated by burial transformed the plant material first into peat, then into softer bituminous coal, and finally, in this specific region, into the harder, purer anthracite. This process required hundreds of millions of years to complete, a span of time that dwarfs even the most ancient moments of human history. And yet, within this unfathomably ancient rock, for men encountered evidence of comparatively recent human activity. This juxtaposition captures something that this entire narrative has circled around. Human history, however far back it actually extends, remains only the briefest chapter within the much vaster story of the planet itself. Let us turn our attention now to the documented human history of this region, the history that existed long before any coal company arrived. The broader region of northeastern Pennsylvania, in the centuries immediately preceding sustained European contact, fell within the territory of several related indigenous nations, most prominently the Susquehannock people. Their name, adapted by early European settlers, derives from their long association with the Susquehanna River. Their villages, according to archaeological and historical record, were substantial, well-organized settlements supporting populations considerably larger than popular imagination typically credits to pre-Columbian societies in this part of the country. The Susquehannock, linguistically and culturally related to the broader Iroquoian language family, maintained a sophisticated agricultural economy centered on the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash. This Three Sisters cultivation system supported large semi-permanent villages and allowed for the kind of population density that made monumental construction projects feasible. European accounts from the earliest period of sustained contact describe palisade villages containing, by their estimates, several thousand residents in some of the largest settlements. They were organized around longhouses constructed using sophisticated timber framing techniques. This is the genuine historical context that surrounded our Pennsylvania Valley, a context of substantial, sophisticated, agriculturally based indigenous civilization that had occupied this landscape for many centuries before any European settler arrived. A civilization that would be devastated within a few decades of sustained contact, not primarily through direct military conflict, but through waves of European-introduced disease. By the time the area had passed fully into American control, the Susquehannock, as a distinct organized political and cultural entity, had been almost entirely destroyed. This historical context matters enormously for understanding the broader significance of tonight's story. Whatever the chamber contained, it existed within a landscape that had genuinely supported substantial, organized, technologically sophisticated human civilization for many centuries, quite possibly for a considerably longer span of time extending back into the more distant and less documented woodland period traditions. The chamber did not need to represent evidence of some exotic or impossible civilization to be genuinely significant. It needed only to represent a previously undocumented physical trace of the very real indigenous civilizations that we already know through extensive archaeological and historical research occupied this landscape for many generations. As tonight's story draws closer to its end, it is worth gathering together one final time the various threads we have followed. We began with four exhausted men standing at the edge of an opening that should not have existed. We traced the careful, honest investigation conducted by an amateur antiquarian whose private notes represent the most detailed account of what that chamber contained. We considered the range of explanations that might account for what was found. We followed the quiet persistence of the people who kept this story alive. And we considered the broader pattern this case fits into, a pattern of careless, accidental encounters with pre-Columbian history, almost none of which received the kind of scientific attention that might have settled their significance. There is one more thread worth following, a thread that takes us beyond what the surviving record can strictly verify into careful, honest speculation. It concerns the question of what might still remain, not in any physically accessible sense, but in the sense of what other similarly sealed spaces might exist, scattered across this same region, waiting for their own accidental discovery. The geological conditions that produced the chamber were not unique. The broader anthracite region contains an extensive network of natural fractures, voids, and underground water channels. If the chamber represented genuine evidence of ancient human use, accessed originally through some now-collapsed entrance before later geological processes buried it, there is no obvious reason why similar spaces might not exist elsewhere. This possibility connects to a broader pattern researchers have noted with some consistency. Genuine archaeological significance often correlates with exactly the kind of geological features that later industrial activity finds most attractive. Caves that provided shelter often sit within the same limestone formations that later attracted quarrying operations. River valleys that supported substantial pre-Columbian settlements often became the same river valleys that later industrial development found most valuable. This overlap suggests the chamber was very likely not a singular anomaly, but rather one instance of a considerably larger pattern of pre-Columbian human activity across this region. A pattern of which the vast majority remains even now entirely undiscovered, sealed away beneath ground that has not yet experienced the particular combination of circumstances required to bring it back into the light. As we come now to the close of this long telling, let your mind settle, if it will, on that image we began with. For men standing at the edge of an opening in the dark, lamps held forward, the small circle of light reaching only so far before the darkness simply continued, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had for however many centuries or millennia had passed since anyone had last stood in that space. That image, more than any specific theory, captures something essential about what this story has tried to offer. Not a resolution, not a tidy answer, but something closer to an invitation. An invitation to sit with genuine uncertainty, to find something worthwhile and quietly restful in a mystery that does not insist on resolving itself. The ground beneath this country, beneath every country, holds far more than any single human lifetime could hope to fully uncover. Layer upon layer of accumulated time, stretching back through the documented history of indigenous civilizations like the Susquehannock, back through the genuinely ancient and actively debated questions of exactly when humans first arrived on this continent, back further through hundreds of millions of years of deep geological time recorded in the very anthracite that drew an entire industry into these hills. Within all of that accumulated time, our four miners encountered one small, uncertain fragment, carefully documented by a man who never received the recognition his careful work deserved, sealed away again before the world could properly understand it, and preserved only because a handful of people across the following century cared enough to keep its memory alive. That is where we leave this story tonight, not at an ending exactly, but at a patient, unresolved pause, for men standing at the edge of the dark. The rest of us, more than a century later, still standing at the edge of our own understanding, peering forward into a history that remains, in this specific case and in countless others scattered across this entire continent, genuinely, frustratingly, and beautifully unfinished. Let your thoughts drift now to the wider darkness that sits beneath so much of the world around you. Not just in Pennsylvania, not just in coal country, but everywhere, under every city, under every quiet country road, under the very room where you might be lying right now, as this story carries you towards sleep. Somewhere beneath the modern world, beneath the highways and the shopping centers and the neighborhoods that feel so permanent and so thoroughly known, there are almost certainly other chambers like the one our four miners found. Other passages worked smooth by hands that stopped moving long before anyone alive today was born. Other niches holding objects that nobody currently walking the surface of this continent has ever seen or touched. Most of them will likely remain exactly as they are, sealed, silent, patient, for longer than any of us will live to see them resolved. And there is something in that thought that asks for a certain kind of peace rather than frustration. The same peace, perhaps, that the original investigator seemed to find in his own later years when he wrote that he did not regret what he had been permitted to witness. Think for a moment longer about the particular quality of silence that must have filled that chamber in the centuries before 1891. A silence broken only by whatever slow, almost imperceptible processes were occurring within the rock itself. Water finding new paths through ancient fractures, mineral deposits forming microscopic layers across stone surfaces that had not felt the touch of a human hand since whoever built that space last walked away from it. That silence persisted through the entire sweep of subsequent human history on this continent, through the rise and fall of the Susquehannock villages, through the arrival of European settlers and the slow transformation of the landscape that followed, through the construction of the very coal town that would eventually rise above that buried chamber, until finally, on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, A blast charge cracked through stone that had held its silence for longer than anyone could measure. And for one brief, disorienting moment, that ancient quiet met the modern world. Lamp light meeting darkness that had never expected to be found. And then, just as quickly, the silence returned. The passage sealed, first with timber, later with concrete, and the groundwater rose slowly over the following decades to return that chamber to something close to the same undisturbed state it had occupied before its brief accidental rediscovery. In a sense, the chamber has now spent more total time in that final modern silence, sealed beneath concrete and rising water, than it spent open to human knowledge during the brief window between 1891 and the early years of the 20th century. The mystery did not end because it was solved. It ended in the most practical sense available to it, because the world simply moved on. The way the world tends to do with most mysteries, it is not sufficiently motivated to resolve, leaving behind only the patient, partial record that a small handful of people cared enough to preserve. There is a particular comfort, I think, in stories that end this way. Stories that do not insist on tying every thread into a neat and satisfying conclusion. Because real history, the actual history of this continent and the countless human lives that have passed across it, rarely offers the clean resolution that fiction provides. The four miners lived out the remainder of their lives carrying an experience they never fully understood. And in carrying it, in choosing in their own halting and imperfect ways to remember it and occasionally share fragments of it with people they trusted, they ensured that some small portion of what they witnessed survived long enough to reach you tonight, more than a century later, drifting towards sleep. Their strange, unresolved discovery settling quietly into your own thoughts. One more layer added to the long, accumulated history of a story that may never be fully told, but that for tonight, at least, has been carried just a little further forward. Consider how strange it is that the only reason any of this reaches you at all is because of a chain of small, almost accidental human choices stretching across more than a century. Each one fragile, each one easily broken at any point along the way. If the foreman had destroyed the worked stone fragment instead of mailing it, if that letter had been lost, if the investigator had never written down his reflections, if the folklorist had never taken the time to sit with elderly residents, if the modern historian had never developed the specific patient curiosity required to spend a decade chasing old maps. Each one of these moments represents a point where this story could have simply vanished, joining the countless other half-documented incidents from this same period that left behind no trace. The fact that this particular story survived, fragmentary and uncertain as it remains, owes everything to a series of individual people who, for reasons that often had little to do with any grand sense of historical mission, simply chose curiosity over convenience, chose preservation over disposal, chose the quiet, unglamorous work of writing things down and keeping old records over the much easier path of letting an inconvenient mystery simply fade away. This is, in its own way, perhaps the truest lesson this story has to offer. More durable and more broadly applicable than any specific theory about ancient chambers or pre-Columbian civilizations. History survives not because it is important in some abstract, predetermined sense, but because individual people, scattered across generations, make the small, often unrewarded choice to remember, to record, to ask one more question before letting a thread go entirely. Perhaps that is enough for tonight. Perhaps the wondering itself, carried gently and without urgency, toward whatever conclusions you find most reasonable, is the appropriate place to leave this story resting, at least until sleep finally arrives and carries your own thoughts somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere this particular chamber of buried American history can simply settle into the same patient, undisturbed darkness it has occupied for most of its long, largely unknown existence. waiting perhaps for whatever the future eventually decides to do with whatever still remains of it. If you have stayed with this story this far into the night, drifting somewhere between full wakefulness and the soft edges of sleep, I would love to know where you are listening from right now and what time it happens to be where you are. I always read through the comments, and there is something quietly remarkable about realizing how many different places, how many different time zones are connected by this same slow telling at this exact moment. Someone in the eastern United States, perhaps not far from the very hills this story describes. Someone across the ocean in Europe, where the morning may already be breaking. Someone on the other side of the world where the afternoon sun is still high. It is a strange and gentle kind of connection, all of us scattered across the globe, brought together briefly by a story about four men and a small circle of lamplight pushing against an old, patient darkness in the Pennsylvania hills. It is worth, in these final quiet minutes, returning once more to the specific texture of that moment in 1891. Picture the air in that passage, thick with the dust that any fresh blast produces. The smell of spent blasting powder mixing with whatever faint, unfamiliar mineral scent the chamber itself carried. Picture the particular quality of sound in that space. The way their own breathing and careful footsteps seemed to echo back from directions that did not quite match where the walls should have been. The disorienting layered acoustics of a large, irregular underground chamber that none of them had any prior experience navigating. Picture too the specific, human fear that must have accompanied even the most curious among them. A fear not of any specific identified threat, but the deeper, primal fear that comes from finding yourself somewhere genuinely unprecedented. Somewhere your accumulated experience has not prepared you to properly interpret. Every instinct these men had developed was built around reading natural stone, natural gas pockets, natural patterns of collapse and stability. None of that hard-won instinct applied cleanly to a space that had clearly been shaped by deliberate human hands, by purposes and techniques entirely unfamiliar to them. And yet, even within that fear, the surviving account suggests something closer to wonder than to panic. A careful, curious engagement with the unknown that speaks well of these men. Working people with no formal education in archaeology or geology, who nonetheless approach something genuinely extraordinary with patience, with care, and with enough presence of mind to retreat when caution demanded it. That balance between genuine fear and genuine curiosity, between caution and the pull of discovery, runs through this entire story from its very first moments to its final unresolved conclusion. And it captures something true not just about this specific incident, but about the broader human relationship with mystery itself. Let this be then the final image we carry forward from tonight's long telling. Not the sensationalized underground temple with its invented treasure and baseless claims. A version built for excitement rather than truth. Not the wilder fringe theories that later decades would attach. Theories that the careful surviving record does not support. Instead, simply this: four tired men working an ordinary shift in an ordinary Pennsylvania coal town, breaking through by pure accident into a darkness considerably older than anything their own lives or their own century had prepared them to understand. A careful, curious investigator, working largely alone and without institutional support, doing his honest best to document what he found before the world around him sealed it away again, this time for good. A chain of small, fragile, almost accidental acts of preservation stretching across more than 100 years that allowed at least some fragment of this story to survive long enough to reach you tonight. Somewhere beneath that Pennsylvania hillside, beneath rising groundwater and collapsed timber and a century of accumulated silence, whatever remains of that chamber continues to rest exactly as it has rested for most of its long, mostly unknown existence. Undisturbed, patient, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone above ever fully understands what it once held. That patience, in its own quiet way, is perhaps the most fitting note to end on tonight. The reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly, or perhaps even solved at all within any single human lifetime, but are instead meant to be carried gently and without urgency from one curious mind to the next across however many generations it takes for the full truth. If a full truth even exists to be found, to finally come to light, or to simply remain quietly and permanently its own. Let your thoughts settle now. Let the image of that small circle of lamplight fade gently into whatever dreams the rest of this night has waiting for you. The story has been told as carefully and as honestly as the surviving evidence allows. And whatever you choose to believe about what those 4 miners actually found in 1891, the simple accumulated fact of their experience, preserved against considerable odds across more than a century, is itself a quiet testament to how much of this continent's deeper history still waits beneath our feet. Patient, undisturbed, and entirely capable of surprising us again whenever the ground next happens to give way. Before we close tonight's telling completely, it is worth acknowledging one last time just how many small threads this single story has touched. Threads that reach back through the deep geological time recorded in that ancient anthracite, through the sophisticated, tragically diminished civilizations of the Susquehannock and their neighbors, through the genuinely contested scientific debate over the earliest peopling of this continent, through the careless, accidental pattern of industrial discovery that scattered similar incidents across this country, and finally through the fragile, accumulated chain of individual human care that allowed even this much of the story to survive long enough to reach you tonight. Whatever those 4 men actually found beneath that Pennsylvania hillside in 1891, whatever the truth of that sealed and flooded chamber ultimately turns out to be, if it is ever resolved at all, the story itself, carried this far by so many careful, unrewarded hands across more than a century, has already accomplished something quietly remarkable simply by surviving. It has reminded us, gently and without insisting on any particular conclusion, that the ground beneath this entire continent still holds far more than any single generation could hope to fully know. That history remains, in the most genuine sense, still unfinished. And that somewhere out there, beneath some other quiet hillside or some other forgotten valley, another small circle of lamplight may yet someday push back against another patient darkness that has been waiting just as long, just as quietly, for its own turn to finally be found. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Also, like and subscribe to my channel, Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.